I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to defend his cause. Maintain the honors of his word, the glory of his cross.
So we've been going through in our series looking at natural science as evidence for the existence of God. And thus far what we've looked at on our first evening, we looked at astronomy and cosmology and looked at where the earth is in the place of the universe and all the unique attributes that earth has. And then last night we went into biology, and in particular zoology is what we looked at. We looked at a number of animals, and in fact we had more animals than we had time to look at, and you're certainly welcome to the additional notes on that if you would like. And so in this hour and the next, we're going to still be in biology. We're going to be looking at the human body. And for this hour, we'll start with the brain and move on to talk about the 12 different systems that are within our body. And then in the second hour, we want to look at the eye and the ear and then add in the other senses that we have as well. We've started each of our sessions with quotes, and we're going to do the same in this session as well. This is a quote from David Berlinski, who is a philosopher and mathematician, senior fellow of the Discovery Institute Center for Science and Culture. We don't have his name on there yet because this is the first half of the quote. It's a lengthy quote. But what he says is this. Now, well, let me give you the context of it. Darwin, in his work, Descent of Man, wrote, "The difference in mind between man and the higher animals, great as it is, certainly is one of degree and not of kind." And so Berlinski answers this silly evolutionary fairy tale, which continues to be touted by evolutionary scientists. And so what he says is this: no distinction in kind rather than degree between ourselves and the chimps? No distinction? Seriously, folks. Here is a simple operational test. The chimpanzees invariably are the ones behind the bars of their cages. There they sit, solemnly munching bananas, searching for lice, aimlessly loping around, baring their gums, waiting for the experiment to begin. No distinction? No species in the animal world organizes itself in the complex, dense, difficult fashion that is typical of human societies. In all of history, no animal has stood staring at the night sky in baffled respect and amazement. The rest of the quote. The chimpanzees are static creatures solemnly poking for grubs with their sticks, inspecting one another for fleas. One may insist, of course, that all this represents differences merely of degree. Very well. Only a difference of degree separates man from the Canadian goose. Individuals of both species are capable of entering the air unaided and landing some distance from where they started. Foolishness. We understand there's differences, between us and the geese, as he talks about. We can both get in the air. You and I, we can jump a couple feet. The geese can fly for hours and hours and hours. But there is a huge difference between the chimpanzee and mankind. They are not the same. And yet that needs to be what evolutionary scientists will put forth. They say we came from a common ancestor. That's part of the theory, and so they need to support the theory. And so that is their claim. Richard Dawkins, we've had a few quotes thus far from Dawkins. He is a zoologist. His title, and I don't know that he holds this position anymore, but when he was with Oxford University, he was the professor for the public understanding of science. To me, that sounds like a made-up title so that he can teach evolution. I don't know whether that's the case or not, but just the nature of the title sounds like, all right, I'm here to make sure you understand science, evolution. That seems to be the case. But anyhow, here's what Dawkins has to say. The theory of species selection growing out of that punctuated equilibria is a stimulating idea which may well explain some single dimensions of quantitative change in macroevolution. I would be very surprised if it could be used to explain the sort of complex, multidimensional adaptation that I find interesting. The Paley's watch, or organs of extreme perfection and complication kind of adaptation that seems to demand a shaping agent at least as powerful as a deity. So he casts doubt on natural selection's ability to explain the vast changes that are necessary to go from primordial soup to what we see in existence today. And even though he does speak of a deity, and I might point you to the year 1983, this was some time ago, and I think he's certainly strengthened his opposition to any kind of opening the door to a deity whatsoever, but he doesn't really open the door. He mentions it here, and then he goes ahead and he rejects that idea and pursues some other kind of evolutionary process in order to explain how this would come to be. But in the quote, he mentions Paley's watch. And so let me speak for a moment about Paley's watch. Paley, it's William Paley that he's referring to, who was a late 18th century clergyman and apologist and philosopher. And in his book, Natural Theology, Paley spoke of the absurdity of finding a watch laying on the ground and concluding that it had always been there. How did it get there? It was the idea. And so rather, the detail and the design of the watch demands that there was a watchmaker somewhere along the line and somebody dropped the watch out there in the woods, wherever it was that it be found. And so he uses that analogy for creation. And the conclusion that he draws is this: every indication of contrivance, every manifestation of design which exists in the watch exists in the works of nature, with the difference on the side of nature of being greater or more, and that in a degree which exceeds all computation. Compare the watch and its complexity with the universe and its complexity. There's no comparison. Last night we took a toy out of a Kinder Egg, and just 3 pieces, and how long before it gets itself put together by shaking that? Well, it's never going to happen, as simple as that toy is. And that's sort of the same idea. The watch, which of course is more complex than our toy was, but then creation, all of the universe and all that is in it, is just far more complex. Simply put, design demands a designer. And the more complex the design, the more evident it should be that there needs to be an adequate designer to explain that design. So we focused on animals that could not evolve in our last session. As I mentioned, today we're going to look at the human body and some things about the human body. And so we're better to start then with the brain. Isaac Asimov, a professor of biochemistry and a prolific novelist. Apparently he wrote over 500 novels. Recipient of all kinds of awards for science fiction writing and so forth. He's written about the brain, and this is what Isaac Asimov had to say about the brain. In man is a 3-pound brain, which, as far as we know, is the most complex and orderly arrangement of matter in the universe. How could the human brain develop out of the primeval slime? That's a great question. And I think evolutionists need to deal with that question. We've got something exceptionally complex going on inside of our heads. And how does that happen just through natural selection and random accidents that would take place? And so, but despite him acknowledging the complexity of the brain and his seeming disdain for the evolutionary theory and its explanation of how that might come to be, Asimov does not find God to be the solution. He was an atheist. And so if we were to continue reading in his work, what we would find is he believed that somehow the sun's energy was responsible for life on earth and to bring that about in all of its complexities. And we ask the question how, and he really doesn't get into the kind of detail we need to know how. Now, we're not going to go into all the complexities of the brain so far as neurons and synapses and those kinds of things. As I said on Thursday night, I'm a preacher, not a scientist, and so I would get lost in a lot of that kind of discussion. But we are going to talk about some of the functions of the brain which evolution has no explanation for. Some of the things that you and I are able to do with our minds that just do not fit inside of the evolutionary theory. And then, again, after that, we're going to start talking about those various systems inside of our body. And so, as we think about some of the functions of the human brain, the first thing that I think we need to focus on is consciousness. We are aware of ourselves and of our surroundings. We know where we are, we know what we're doing, we have this self-awareness about ourselves, and evolutionary scientists have admitted they cannot explain consciousness. Not quite sure how that works. In 2003, Colin McGinn, in his work entitled Philosophy of Mind, Contemporary Readings, he asked the question, how could the aggregation of millions of individually insentient neurons generate subjective awareness? Basically, all that firing that's going on inside of our brains, the electrical activity that's going on there, chemical reactions that are going on there, but those chemical reactions inside the brain, no matter how complex they are, should not result in anything more than an elaborate computer. Our computers, you've got a computer, I've got a computer, they're very complex. We understand that they're very complex in the way that they're designed and the way that they work. But they're not sentient. They don't have consciousness. They do things that they are programmed to do. You and I are far above that. We have self-awareness. And no matter how complex the brain is and how many chemical reactions there are, and it still does not explain consciousness. Some evolutionary scientists have gone so far as to claim that consciousness is nothing more than an illusion. You see, you and I are not, well, we saw that with the biology, right? If you're a biologist, you need to convince yourself that the design that you see really is not design. Well, you and I, as human beings, we're supposed to convince ourselves that everything we see and our experience in the world that we're in and our awareness of ourselves is all just an illusion. Daniel Dennett, an American philosopher and cognitive scientist who has been identified as one of the four horsemen of the new atheism, and so alongside Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and Christopher Hitchens, this is what he penned in his work, Consciousness Explained. It's not that he explains it away. But here's what he wrote. He says, what we think of as our consciousness is actually our brains pulling a number of tricks to conjure up the world as we experience it. But in reality, it's all smoke, mirrors, and rapidly firing neurons. I'm curious. Are you having the same experience that I'm having right now? Uh-oh, that's not good. Well, you're not having the exact same experience, but we've gathered together on a Saturday afternoon, and we've sung some songs, and we prayed to the Lord, and we're now studying about the human brain. Is that everybody's experience? Isn't that amazing that all of us together are experiencing the exact same smoke and mirrors? I think there's something more to smoke and mirrors going on here. It's not just, if it's just neurons, my brain is distinct from your brain. None of our brains are working in conjunction here so that we all have the same experience. And yet we're having the same experience, not because of these rapidly firing neurons and smoke and mirrors, but because we have consciousness. Because we have awareness of what's going on around us. The truth is, we're far more than biochemical machines. That's what the evolutionists would like us to believe. We are just biochemical machines and nothing more. We're more than that. We have an eternal soul. We're looking for the explanation of consciousness. We have to look to God and how He created us. Not just as a physical being, but as a spiritual being. All right, so as we continue to think about these functions that we have within the human mind, because we're conscious beings, we're able to process thoughts. And all kinds of thoughts. Just, so many different categories of thoughts. I'm just going to read a list here. I'm not going to read the whole list because we'd spend a lot of time if I read the whole list. But it's baffling to think about how many different kinds of thoughts we're able to have. We can do abductive reasoning. We can do abstract thinking. We can do analogical reasoning. We can do analytical reasoning. Backward induction. Let me untie my tongue. Backward induction. Cognitive bias, cold logic, conceptual thinking, conjecture, contemplation, convergent thinking, counterfactual thinking, creativity, critical thinking, divergent thinking, imagination, inductive reasoning, inference, instinct, introspect. We're going alphabetically. We're in the I's now. There's a whole lot more. But the point is that our brains are capable of all these different kinds of thought. It's not that we are pre-programmed and there's one kind of thing. That's what the computer does. The computer understands a certain way of working and that's it. And the computer can't go beyond that. It can't go beyond the programming. You and I were not programmed. You and I were created by God. And He gave us all these different various forms of ways to process thought. Again, the quote that we began with, He asked, where in all of creation do we find any creature other than mankind who's going to stare at a sunset and be in awe at the beauty of it? You and I are able to have that kind of appreciation. Animals don't, because God didn't make them the same way that He made you and I. Our computer is never going to be able to appreciate a sunset because it's not a conscious being. And so there's just so many things, and again, the evolutionary scientist is unable to explain how we can have those various thought processes go on within our mind. And again, it's more than just biochemical process that's going on. It's associated with our consciousness. How about emotion? We've all got emotion, right? What evolutionary or biological process explains emotion? Now, there's some emotion, I suppose they might be able to. Fear. They might be able to try and find an explanation for fear. How about admiration? The evolutionary scientist doesn't know how to explain admiration. Or awe, again, standing and looking at that sunrise or that sunset. Disgust. Empathy. Sympathy, envy, jealousy, nostalgia. Being able to think about those things in the past and revisit that. Love, joy, sadness, hate, shame. There's no explanation for those things inside the evolutionary theory. Again, they are not biochemical functions. They are not from the physical. They are associated with our consciousness, which is from God. How about conscience? Conscience reveals the existence of morality. That's what drives conscience, is the idea of morality. Evolutionary science cannot explain morality. There's no reason for morality to exist. Why do people do good things? If it's all about survival of the fittest, then I shouldn't do something that's good for you unless it benefits me in some way. And yet, every week we hear about people doing things that do not benefit them that have helped other people. Why would they ever do that? If evolution were true and we're supposed to be products of evolution, we wouldn't want to be doing that kind of thing. Have you heard of somebody going and jumping into a river in order to save a stranger from drowning? Those kind of things take place, right? Why would someone do that? And even more than that, occasionally some of those folks who jump in to go save somebody are not actually able to swim themselves. They are moved by emotion and by conscience. I can't watch this person die, and so they jump in, and oftentimes they may end up saving that person or dying alongside them. What would ever motivate someone to do that? Evolution can't tell us. Because there's no process inside of evolution that would capture the idea of having a conscience. And so there's a number of things that they just simply are unable to explain. We're not going to go into any detail on these, but just three more that we could spend some time pursuing. Communication, the complexity of human communication. I understand animals communicate with one another. But it's very different to bark with somebody than to speak in a language. And humans, well, I'm not sure exactly how many languages there are in the world now, but I know there are a number of them, an enormous number. There's no evolutionary explanation that leads to that kind of communication. The limitless memory that we have, amazing capacity for memory. The problem is often the recall. But again, evolution is unable to explain that. And of course, special skills, sometimes we identify them as God-given skills. I don't know what the evolutionists say about that. They likely wouldn't want to use the phrase God-given. But there's just a number of functions of the human brain that evolution cannot explain to us. All right, well, let's spend some time now looking at the human body and those 12 systems. They're all independent. All 12 of these systems inside of the human body are independent, and yet they are interrelated. They depend on one another. The 12 systems themselves, the skeletal, the muscular, the integumentary, the cardiovascular, nervous, respiratory, digestive, urinary, reproductive, endocrine, immune, and lymphatic. All 12 of those fit inside our body. It just seems amazing to me to be able to list those out and then think, oh, that is inside of here. You know, if we were talking about putting these systems into a factory, a man-made factory, and have them do the kinds of things that they do, it would be a large place that all fits inside the human body. And so let's talk about them and the function that each of them have. And so we'll start with the skeletal because it's the framework of the body. Everything else is either encased inside of it or built upon it. And so the skeletal system is, of course, essential to us. Our skeletal structure, there's two parts to it. There's the axial or the core skeleton. That's what protects our vital organs. And so part of that is the skull. We're protecting our brain inside of the skull. It'd be a really bad thing to have the brain somewhere out where it's going to get hit. Even the slightest blow would cause damage. And so we have it encased in bone. And then, of course, our core. All of our vital organs are inside of a cage so that they're all protected. We wouldn't want our heart sitting out here on our arm. We wouldn't want our lungs on the outside. Again, the slightest little blow and we're dead. And so the design is exactly what we needed with the axial or the core skeleton. The appendicular skeleton, of course, is the arms and the legs, and that's what allows for movement. If we don't have that, we don't go anywhere. And so that allows for movement. But in addition to structure and movement, the skeletal system also stores minerals for later, things such as calcium or iron, and bone marrow, which is essential to blood cells. That's within the skeletal system as well. Well, if all we have is the skeletal system, we're actually not going to go anywhere because bones can't move on their own. And so we need the muscular system to work along with that. And so we have tendons that attach approximately 700 muscles to our skeletal system, and that's what enables us to move. And so every physical movement that we make is performed through those muscles. And we're able to use them consciously. And so when we run or when we walk, when we chew, when we talk, all of those things are a function of the muscular system. The skeletal muscles, again, they're voluntary. We're able to control those. But we also have some involuntary muscles. And I'm thankful that they're involuntary. Things like the stomach. Imagine if you had to think about digesting your food. We don't have to do that. It works involuntarily. The intestines, and we don't have to think about pulling out the good things that are in the food to get that into the bloodstream and then sending the bad stuff on its way. Our heart, the cardiac muscle, is one of those involuntary muscles. So you and I can go to sleep at night and not have to worry about keeping our heart going while we're sleeping. And I need to focus on getting it going, keeping it going. That's simply not the case. And so we have these involuntary muscles within our body as well, which we just simply don't have to think about. So we've got the skeletal system, the muscular system on top of that, and then the integumentary system on top of that. That's our skin. Skin, nails, hair, all those kinds of things. And it serves a great purpose. It protects us. Can you imagine not having your skin, how easily susceptible you would be to infections? Just about anything we might touch. I don't like touching door handles all that much because who knows what kind of filth is on there. But imagine we didn't have skin to touch that with, right? And we would be susceptible to all kinds of bacteria and so forth. And so God gave us this outer shell, if you will, to protect the things that are inside so that we are protected from diseases. But not only that, it also stores water. It stores fat. It helps to maintain our body temperature. It helps us to avoid dehydration. It helps to dispose of waste materials. When we're sweating, that's one of the things that it's doing. And so, again, an essential system. The cardiovascular system. The human heart is amazing. We talked about the giraffe's heart last night. We don't have that 2-foot wide heart. Ours is much smaller. If you're here and you're a young child, make a fist. That's the size of your heart. Okay, not my fist, your fist. That's the size of your heart. All right, those of you who are older and so in your mid to late teens and on up into adulthood, make 2 fists and put those together. All right, that's the size of your heart. All right, and so we've got this heart that is the size of our 2 fists if we're older, 1 fist if we're younger. It weighs less than a pound. It's not heavy at all. The giraffe heart, remember, it was 25 pounds, right? Ours is less than a pound. But it is an exceptional pump. Any idea how many times your heart beats during the day? Every day, yes. It has to do it every day. 100,000 times each day on average. If you have a pulse rate of 69 beats per minute, you're around 100,000. Mine's a little bit lower than that, and so I'm a bit under 100,000 each day. And while it's pumping these 100,000 times during the day, what it's doing is it's moving around about 2,000 gallons of blood through your system. So we take that out a little bit. That means that our hearts beat somewhere in the neighborhood of 37 million beats per year, or in the average lifespan, 3.3 billion beats. How many pumps at some factory that are pumping some kind of liquid are going to last for that kind of duration without having service? Now, sometimes we need to go in and have our heart serviced, don't we? Some people do have heart issues and need to see the cardiologist and so forth, but a number of people, a great large percentage of the population, do not have heart issues at all and go through their entire lifetime with their heart beating consistently 3.3 billion times without error. The circulation of blood through our body, of course, is essential. We need oxygen throughout our body. We need nutrients, the hormones that help our body to function. All of those get distributed in the blood system. It helps us to bring those in and then to expel the bad things, the carbon dioxide and other waste materials. The heart, as we said, it works automatically while we don't have to think about it. But it also adjusts speed as needed. You and I don't have to think about the speed of our heart. And so if we're exercising, take your pulse when you're exercising. Oh, all right, going a lot faster. That's because you need more blood flowing through your body in order for you to do that activity. And so we might have our heart rate raise up to 120, 130, 140 beats per minute while we're exercising. But then after that, we go home and it's time to go to bed. Your heart doesn't beat near as fast when you're in bed. In fact, if your average is 69 beats per minute at your resting heart rate, it's lower than that when you're sleeping. And so it has the ability to make those adjustments on its own. You want to change that pump at the factory and how quickly it's pumping it. It won't do it by itself. It needs some kind of human interaction in order for that to take place. It takes about 20 seconds for the blood to circulate throughout your entire vascular system. 20 seconds. In a single day, your blood travels a total of 12,000 miles through your body. If we were able to line up all of our arteries and veins and capillaries, any idea how long that would be?
A while.
It'd be long. 60,000 miles long. Think about that. You have 60,000 miles worth of veins and arteries and capillaries inside your body. That's just baffling to the mind. The heart muscle is the hardest working muscle in the human body. In fact, what I've read is that it works harder than the legs of a sprinter. We know how hard the sprinter's legs, you can see how active those muscles are and the strain that's on them. Our heart muscles work harder than the legs of a sprinter. And yet most people don't need it to be serviced at all. It works without air. Just amazing design. The nervous system. The nervous system is found throughout the body. It ties into the spinal cord and into our brain. It's like an elaborate computer system. It sends and receives information. The brain controls what goes on with that information and sends back the appropriate functions within the body. There's multiple systems active inside of the nervous system. We've got the cranial nervous system, which that deals with functions like nasal, which I'm having difficulty with right now, but also hearing and sight and taste and chewing and swallowing and cranial movement. And then there's 31 spinal nerves extending from the neck down to the tailbone, and they deal with various motor skills and sensory functions and that kind of thing. The brain and the spinal cord are referred to as the central nervous system, and it's wonderfully protected. We already talked about you got the brain up there protected by the skull. The spinal cord, wouldn't it be so awful if it was just right down the front of our chest? We'd have to wear some kind of protection to make sure it never gets contacted. And we know what happens when people have spinal cord injuries. They can't walk, perhaps afterward, or might even be quadriplegic. And so the design that was given for our nervous system and for that spinal cord, it runs down through the vertebrae column. If you've seen a skeleton in the doctor's office or something like that, if you look down the back of the vertebrae, there's actually a hole there. And that hole is not there so that they can put their cord through so to hold it all together in the office. That's where the spinal cord goes. It is protected from top to bottom. The nerves that extend from it throughout the rest of the body to our organs, our limbs, and so forth, they're referred to as the peripheral nerves. These peripheral nerves, there's two distinct parts to that. There's the somatic nervous system. That's what carries sensory and voluntary movement information to and from the central nervous system. That's how we interact with the world around us. That's what enables us to interact. And then the other, of course, is the autonomic, which takes care of all those things that we don't have to think about, our heart pumping and digestion and all those kinds of things. All right.
I'm not ashamed to own my